Welcome to our first lecture, An Introduction to Neijing Medicine. Over the course of the year, you're going to see that we start every lecture we have with this picture of the young monk turning the prayer wheels. And this is to remind us that we are on a path of circular learning, that we are looking at a few principal ideas from many different viewpoints again and again and again. And each time we do it, it's like turning this wheel and deepening our understanding of the main ideas. So we have this here to remind us that every lecture is like that. And by the way, if you miss something or don't get it the first time, don't worry, because in circular learning, you'll always be seeing it again. We also start the lecture with a picture that kind of summarizes things. Now in this picture, I have an image of Western practitioners working, and that's to remind us that this is not just about Chinese medicine. This material is not just about that. It's about medicine in general. The concepts in the Neijing have the power to change both how we practice Western medicine and Chinese medicine. And in the end of the day, when we have different categories like Chinese medicine or Western medicine, they're just different points of view on the same issues that people have. And so one of the important things about Neijing medicine is that it has the potential to expand these principles out into the world and go past just the Chinese medicine community. I'll also be talking about physicians in the class. When I say physician or physician level training, I don't mean your license, whether you're an MD or a DO or a surgeon or an acupuncturist or physical therapist. I mean a way of thinking. And a physician level thinking, my definition of it is a person who can successfully manage medical complexity through a thorough understanding of basic principles. So versus people who are treating from algorithms or sheets on the wall that tell you what to do, that's fine as long as it works, but then they can't really change if the problem becomes complex. So a physician or physician level thinking is the ability to walk into a complicated situation that is confusing others perhaps and make sense of it by going back to basic principles. So when I say physician, I'm referring to that thinking, not just a license. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Talk a little bit about how the Neijing is a root of our practice. Talk a little bit about the Neijing text. I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of knowledge we get out of the Neijing text, and we'll be continuing this in our lecture on classical scholarship. We'll talk about the special features of our times, why it's special to practice Neijing medicine now. And then I'm going to just review some of the basic principles of Neijing medicine, and then we'll have a summary. Okay, so let's begin with this idea of the root. So we can start by taking a look at this slide. We have two practitioners. They're both using acupuncture needles or needles. One is a physical therapist and one is a Chinese medicine practitioner. And the question we have is, how can you tell the difference? And it turns out if you were hired by the World Health Organization or something like that to go around the world and decide who's a Chinese medicine practitioner or not, the one reliable indicator is if the theoretical basis of their practice can be traced back to the Huangdi Neijing. That's the one differentiating factor. People can be putting needles in sore points or in muscles, but if they don't have a theoretical basis that traces back to the Neijing, they're not practicing Chinese medicine. That's the one reliable indicator. So right there, we can see how important these writings are for us. And here's just a schematic of that to show you. And if you haven't studied Chinese medicine before, don't worry about these. These are major texts in the field of Chinese medicine. So it just shows that the Huangdi Neijing, which was a text written somewhere in the Warring States Han Dynasty period, was really the root of all of the other texts. It fed the Zhenzhou Jiaijing and acupuncture, including the standardization in the Northern Song Dynasty. It was the root of that. through the Ming acupuncture texts. And on the herbal side, it was the theoretical basis for the Shanghanlun, the cold damage treatise, the fever school texts, the Ming and Qing herbal texts, all the way up into the formulation of TCM in the 60s, which we have now. So we can see how important this text is. And when we look at it in this way, we can see that Chinese medicine is like a very old tree. It has roots, and it has its terminal roots extend into the soil, into ideas that predate the Warring States period. And then there's a root ball, and the root ball is what supports the life of the tree as it regenerates and moves through the cycles. The root ball for Chinese medicine is the Huangdi Neijing. So we call it a root text in that way. By the way, we're going to see these ideas of roots and the growth of trees and plants over and over again in the Neijing. And as a matter of fact, when I was first translating the Neijing in the early 2000s, one of the most helpful books I had that to help me decode things and understand things was a book on botany. So I kept referring back to that, and you're going to see this come up over and over again. So here's the idea. If you have a healthy root, it spreads down to the ground, it spreads up into the sky. And so, this whole tree is dependent on its root system to support this life. And so, for example, if you think about where we are now in TCM, in the post-1960s world of Chinese medicine, we're really picking fruits that grow on a tree whose roots are back 2,000 years. And so, for example, we can say that the fruit of a tree is the lemon or the fruit, or we can say it's a kind of practice. So we're going to look at the Neijing and see that it is a root text. There's similar root texts. For example, the root texts of the writings of the Buddha support the religion of Buddhism. And so without that continually going back to the root, there's a loss of vitality and transmission. So it's the same idea. If you look at Buddhism, it's like an old tree. The root is in the life of the Buddha and his sayings, and its expressions or its fruit are out here in the times we live in. And then the tree of Buddhism is maintained by nourishing the root, by continually going back to the root to nourish growth. And this is what happens in a tree root every spring when it sends out new life. So here's our first Chinese character. By the way, there's 3 kind of key characters that we see in the Neijing over and over again that help tell us some things. I'll go through all 3 of them here. They are the characters for wood, silk, and water. This is the character for wood, mu, and it's a picture of a tree. Pretty simple. If we wanted to indicate that we're talking about the tree root and not just the tree, then we put a slash through the bottom to indicate the tree root, and it looks like this. And that's pronounced bun. And we're going to see that there's 2 kinds of roots that we talk about in the Neijing. One is the main root ball, which is bun, and one is the terminal roots, the things that grow out into the soil. They're called gun. But for right now, we're just talking about this idea of the root and how the Neijing is like that root text. So basic principle here, human traditions like Buddhism, Chinese medicine, religions are nourished by ancient thoughts, writings, and experience. These concepts allow continued vitality, innovation, and scholarship over subsequent generations. If the root is not maintained, these traditions can stagnate, wither, and die. So, for example, right now in Chinese medicine, my feelings is that there's a real problem in the lack of innovation. And part of that is from a lack of contact with the root. You might say that Chinese medicine is old and everything was written down and we just do that, but that's not actually true. When we look at the history of Chinese medicine, it's been a field of innovation, of continual innovation of new ideas And that's all by going back to the root. And at the moment, we're somewhat cut off from that root. And there really is a lack of innovation. And the field in general has a little bit of stasis, and it's not moving as well as it should, in my opinion. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about the text, what it is, and we're going to have a whole lecture on this coming up about the history of the Neijing text and talk about it in more detail. This is just an overview. So the first thing is we want to get away from the idea that it's just a medical textbook. So I was trained as an internist, an emergency room physician, and in each of those fields there's a textbook, and it tells you how to treat certain illnesses, and you can follow the instructions, and you can look up in the index and see how to treat any number of conditions and so forth that's standardized in the field. And that's not the situation we're dealing with here. It would be nice if it was that way. Maybe it'll be that way in the future, who knows? But it's really not. And that's one of the reasons people have trouble engaging with the Neijing text. It's because they expect it to be a book like that, and they go to find the answers to things and they don't see them. So as we go along in this course, I'm going to show you there's a few key things to open the text that really opens up its knowledge. But just looking at it from the outside, it can be confusing to people. So the other thing about this we'll see is that we're working in an archaeological site, and we call it text archaeology. And so the same things apply. We are discovering things. What we're discovering is lines of text and characters and ideas. We're taking them out, brushing them off, putting them on a shelf, trying to figure out what they are, trying to use the science of sinology and history and culture and language to understand them. It also means that we're not certain about everything. So when you enter into this study, you're entering into an active archaeological dig site. So it's exciting, there's great information that comes out, but it's a research site. So you'll hear me say a lot during the course, that's in the research box, meaning we have it, we've identified it as a research issue, and we haven't worked it out yet, but we're working on it. The archaeology that we're doing is not in the ground, it's in text. So we're constantly working through text and through characters. For this course, you don't have to know Chinese language, but you do have to work through the text with someone who does know Chinese. This is the teachers who will be helping you, or myself, to see. And you can walk with us as we look at it. I'd also say, Chinese is a difficult language, but if this is your field and your life's work, the one thing that can really change your relationship to the medicine is to study some Chinese. And even a little bit helps. So the more you know, the better. And you will learn a lot in this course in terms of looking at characters, and we'll be looking at text. But if you have the opportunity to go and study, that's also great for your practice. So a little bit about the Neijing text, just an overview. It was written in the form of 162 chapters, or I should say the form that we have now, sometimes during the Warring States and Han Dynasty periods, as I mentioned. We don't know exactly when it was written. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's different ideas. What we do know is it was written by different people. You can tell this from the writing styles and also from various schools. So in the Neijing, there are descriptions of techniques that are very similar but have different names, which make us think that there were different schools doing the same principles, but they talked about them differently. But somehow this all got put into a text. When we read the Neijing, most of the passages are written as a series of discussions between the Yellow Emperor and his esteemed teachers, the people that were teaching him about nature and the universe. And when we encounter the text today, we will see that it's divided into two primary sections. One is called the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, the Plain Questions. The Suwen is what it is in Chinese, so you'll hear it referred to as the Suwen. And the other is the Huangdi Neijing Lingshu, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, the Divine Pivot. Actually, neither of those translations really conveys the meaning of what those characters mean in Chinese, or not very well, I should say. We'll talk a little bit about that in other lectures. But that's how you'll hear it referred to, either the Neijing or the Su Wen, which is the first book, or the Ling Shu, which is the second book. You also commonly heard it say that this Su Wen is primarily about theory and the Ling Shu is about acupuncture. And that's not altogether correct. There's actually a lot about acupuncture in the Su Wen, the first book. However, the second book, The Divine Pivot, is primarily about acupuncture, but it also contains a lot of theory, so there's overlap there. And so here's just a schematic of that. We have the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, and it's divided into these two books, the Huangdi Neijing Su Wen and the Huangdi Neijing Ling Shu. What I would say also when I say the current version, because as we're going to see in the lecture on the Neijing, there was a lot of reorganization and editing of this text. The text we have now comes from the 11th century, and so it's the current version. More on that in another lecture. So, what does the Neijing text tell us? It provides a comprehensive, detailed model of the universe. So this is really where the Neijing shines, its power. If we look at the world we live in, there's the world that we see around us. The Neijing idea is that that world is built on patterns of energy and motion that we don't see. And those patterns of energy and motion have their own rules and principles, and they generate the world that we do see. And so it gives us a look behind the curtain into the way that the universe works, and that's just immensely powerful. So first and foremost, the Neijing text is a book about how the universe works. And secondarily, it's a book about how those principles build a practice of medicine. So first it's about natural science, then it's about the special case of medicine. The Neijing gives the basic terms of Chinese medicine. It gives the basic theories. It defines the anatomy and the physiology. For example, what's now the channel system is loosely based on the early text. It defines how we do acupuncture, what are the needle techniques, and it defines the theories for herbal medicine and more. So there's a lot in there. However, there's this important caveat, caution, and that's that when you move around the world, very few people are familiar with these writings in an in-depth way. In China, of course, you'll find more people. In the West, not very many. If I go into a Chinese medicine conference and ask someone what's in chapter 17 of the Su Wen, very few people would know. Most people have read it from an English translation, which most of those are not very good, to be honest. The Unschool translation is one exception. That's on the recommended reading list. However, their knowledge is not from engaging with the characters directly, and that's key. Fewer people know how to actually use these ideas to treat anybody. So it's one thing to sit around and talk about ideas. It's another one to know how to treat childhood leukemia or some kind of orthopedic problem or heart disease or kidney failure. That's very rare. That's where the kind of our work and this course shines, because it's really aimed at how do we put it all into practice. And the last thing is an important one. Original descriptions in the Neijing text about the terms and the principles, when we look at what we think about those things today, they're very different. So, and that's not known by most people. So it's almost easier to think of Neijing medicine as a separate branch of medicine than Chinese medicine, although they're very close, they're tied in many ways, but they're also different in significant ways. Okay, let's go back to this idea of the root again. So in Chinese thinking, we have this idea that nature is set up on basic principles, and then the details fill in around those principles. They use the analogy of the loom here. And so the idea is that the vertical threads are the principles of nature upon which the world is established. And the horizontal threads are all the things you see that grow on those principles. So, for example, all the flowers and plants and animals and people, they are things that are growing on basic principles. They're the horizontal threads. The vertical threads are the principles. In Chinese thinking, it's the same also. So we talk about books that contain the core principles, and they are called Jing Shu. Shu in Chinese means book or writing, and Jing is a character we're going to see over and over again. So some books hold the principles, and other books give the explanation. And the books that give the explanation or the commentary on the basic principles are called Wei Shu. And both of these characters, Jing and Wei, they also refer back in some ways to that idea of the loom. So the Jing character is the vertical threads of the loom, and the Wei character is the woof threads or the horizontal threads of the loom. So if we look at that character Jing, we're going to see this again and again during the class. We can see that its basic definition is a longitudinal thread of a loom, a warp thread. It's used to talk about a classic text. So the Huang Di Ne Jing means that this is a classic of the Yellow Emperor. It's that character Jing. It also means, as we're going to see, a certain pattern in nature about how nature makes itself, and that is an axial pattern or a pattern from heaven to earth. It's like the same idea as the loom with the vertical thread. We'll see this again and again and have more on this, so don't worry if you don't get it right away. We're going to see it all over the place. If we look at how this character is constructed, on the left we see the radical si, which means silk thread, and on the right we have jing, which means the rivers that run under the earth and the veins of the earth. We have this idea here that we see over and over again in the Neijing, that there are deeper unseen patterns of change and motion happening in the universe. They happen along certain principles. We're going to get to know those principles. Those principles make local patterns like wind, weather, water, circulation, and so forth, and then complex local patterns, for example, flowers and so forth. But all of these latter two are based on the deeper patterns that are moving through the universe. So, for example, if we, and how we're going to know that is by looking at characters. That's going to help us. So when we look at the character Su, which means silk, which is the left side of that Jing character, it's a character that tells us that they're talking about the deeper levels of the cosmos, about how the world is made. We'll talk about this silk character more in another lecture. But basically, when we see that attached to a character, it often tells us that the level they're talking about is at the original cosmological patterning of the universe. If we see this character shui, or water, appended to a character, for example, that tells us that we're looking at local patternings of nature about how water flows through circulation. It's one character that indicates that. And if we look at another character here, ro, which means flesh, it's a picture of meat hanging on a rack. It's a character, when we see it appended to a radical, it's a radical. When we see it appended to a character, it tells us that we're talking about something anatomical or physical. So if we look at those three characters, if we see these three things appended to a character, it'll tell us whether we're talking about the cosmological level of unseen patterning, the local level of how nature is working in our environment, or how it's working in anatomy. And this is one way we know what level they're talking about when they use characters. So if we look at what are some examples of Jing texts, these ideas that have the primary ideas of a tradition, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic is the one on medicine, which we'll be studying this year. The Tao Te Jing, the Jing, the classic of the way of virtue. You've heard about that. The I Ching, or the Book of Changes, also sometimes called the Zhou or the Zhou Dynasty Book of Changes. The Confucian Analects, the Lunyu, the Zhou Dynasty gnomon classic of calculations. The gnomon stick was something you put in the ground and measure angles. It's also a Jing text, which was a basis for the practice of mathematics. And if we look outside the tradition of Chinese medicine, the Torah, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, the writings of the Buddha, those are all examples of Jing texts. And how do we know that they're Jing texts? Because they support an entire tradition of thought or philosophy or practice. If we look at commentary texts in Chinese medicine, the Nanjing is clearly a commentary text, even though it's misnamed Jing. It's actually a Wei text, which means it's trying to explain things. The Zhenzhou Jai Jing, which was a compendium of acupuncture writings, trying to reorganize and edit them, understand them. The later text about the Qijing Ba Maikao, which was the writings about the extraordinary vessels, which was in later dynasties, which tries to understand the writings about what the extraordinary channels were that gave us a lot of the ideas we think about today. The Bansao Gongmu, which was a principle of herbal medicine, the foundations of herbal medicine. The Talmud would be an example of a Wei text, which is an explanatory text in the Jewish tradition. It's important that we understand these differences because, while Wei texts will help us understand things sometimes, they're also wrong sometimes. They are not texts that regenerate a profession or sustain a practice in the same way that Jing texts are. Jing texts are like that tree root that will maintain growth and vitality over generations. So the basic principle here, in Chinese traditions, Jing texts are essential writings that contain fundamental principles and theories, the core ideas. These ideas have the power to nourish entire traditions of thought and practice over multiple generations if they keep going back to that source. In contrast, Wei texts are explanatory commentaries upon these original texts. The Neijing is a Jing root text which contains principles and theories able to support an entire practice of medicine over generations. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the kinds of knowledge that we find in the Neijing text. As I mentioned before, the idea we have of a medical textbook, this is not really, we're going to see that this is different in many ways, that we're not able to go and just look things up and find them in the way we're used to, and that there's different levels of information we get from this archaeological dig site of the Neijing. So let's look at those. So here's this idea about the archaeology site, and what kind of things are we going to find here? There's 4 basic classes of knowledge here, and maybe a few others. But the main ones are treatment-specific, systems-level, mixed-type, and extrapolated information. And I'll go through each one here. So the first one is type 1 is treatment-specific. That means specific information about where to put a needle, how to mix an herbal formula, how to treat a certain condition. That's the type of information we're used to in medical textbooks. That's pretty rare in the Neijing, actually. It's there, but most of the time you have to understand what they're talking about to get the information out, and they're talking about principles and not specifics. However, I would say that when you do see treatment-specific information, it's usually very good. So the protocols that they do put in there, although they're fewer, they're very good, the ones that they have in there. So whenever we see that, we're very happy to see it. But it's not enough to build a practice of medicine on. So what's an example of treatment specific? So here's Dr. Tu Yoyo. She won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for her studies in malaria. And so during the 60s, she and her team isolated artemisinin from the Chinese herb Qinghao. She was asked by Chairman Mao to find some help for the treatment of malaria because the North Vietnamese army was having a lot of trouble with malaria. So they went to work on that. And she started looking through old Chinese herbal textbooks, just looking on the chapters on how to treat fever. And she took all the herbs that were used and she tested them, and she found this compound artemisinin, which has been very helpful for people. That's now used in combination with other Western drugs for malaria, and it saved millions and millions of lives. The problem is that they extracted that out of a tradition and they put it into a Western tradition. So they took a practice which uses a combination of herbs and practices, and they just extracted one chemical. So now that is becoming resistant because of that issue. Systems level information, type 2, is actually some of the most valuable information. What does systems level means? Systems means that our understanding of health issues is embedded in a story. And so, for example, if we look at the story of cancer, our story about that in Western medicine is that it's something coming into your system, disrupting your system, coming to get you, and the counter to that is to kill it, to take it out, to give it chemotherapy, radiation, and so forth. So this is a way of viewing a problem. So really some of the most valuable information in aging is to look at a problem in an entirely different way. Not the specifics of it, but just the basic way we look at it. So for example, if we look at the example of cancer, the aging gives an ecological model of cancer that's very different. That's not involved with trying to kill cancer, but trying to rehabilitate and restore tissue ecology. So it's a very different way of thinking. So the aging descriptions of physiology and pathology suggest that cancer may arise in response to alterations in three-dimensional biotensegrity structures and blood flow in the host system. That means, we're going to see more talk about this, that all of your tissue planes are breathing and they're interrelated, and blood flows through these tissues like rivers. And when the tissue plane matrix gets obstructed, it causes blood flow to become impaired, and that allows the dysregulation of the system or a lack of coherence in the body, which allows tumors to arise. And our treatment is to reestablish ecology, not to kill cancer cells. So that's a very different way of looking at cancer in general. And these ideas are where you really see a lot of the implications of aging medicine. And so here's this idea, we'll see this over and over again, that all of your cells and their connections are actually breathing and moving in relationship to the environment and the changes in the environment. And they make this thing called a biotensegrity structure, which we'll talk about more, which means every part is interrelated and movable. And the rivers of blood are moving through that. And so really health is more an issue of structure and coherence rather than biochemistry and the other things like that we think of in Western medicine. And so here's this idea that blood vessels are moving through tissue planes, and that the blood can either be healthy and carrying the regulation for the body, or they can move into these areas where the blood is not so healthy. And all of a sudden you have areas that aren't being maintained very well, just like areas of ecology, and that's where tumors can grow, like so forth. And here's a result of treating one tumor with this model and seeing the shrinkage of that. Just with acupuncture needles. So very important. Type 2 is really where we get the big picture, ways of looking at the world in different ways. Type 3 is that you have a mix. So for example, here we are with a patient with tuberculosis. So a quarter of the world's population has tuberculosis right now, and a lot of it is resistant. So there's a lot of people in tuberculosis hospitals just waiting to see if they'll live or die. Basically, they live there often for months to years, and they're just hoping things go one way or the other. In Chinese traditional texts, there's both treatment-specific and system-level approaches. Treatment-specific means there are approaches with herbal medicine needles that are for tuberculosis. Systems level means that there's another way of thinking about infectious diseases, similar to the cancer model, where we talk about ecology and say that these organisms overgrow in areas where the body is not regulating or maintaining itself very well. And then when we reestablish ecology, a lot of these chronic and resistant infections clear up. That's been my experience in the hospital and clinic also. So there's two ways we look at this: specific and more global. And then extrapolated information. Extrapolated information means we're going to be talking about something that is not in the Neijing at all, but we're going to use ideas from the Neijing and then extrapolate them out to something that would not be in the Neijing, and frankly, they wouldn't be thinking about at all, probably. So what's an example of that? So if we look at how oncogenes express, I'll use this idea. If you look at how cancer genes turn on and off in the nuclear matrix, it seems to be regulated in part by the structural changes inside the cell. And so if we look at that biotensegrity model again, which is based on Neijing principles, we can extrapolate that all the way out to say not just the biotensegrity of the body, but the biotensegrity within the cell nucleus where DNA is being expressed. And so if we change the matrix around the cellular nucleus where these things are happening, we change how DNA is expressed. That seems to be something we see when we work in this way, but it needs to be validated by research and so forth. But it's a very interesting idea. Of course, they weren't thinking about oncogenes or the cellular nucleus, but we can take the ideas that they have and we can take them all the way out here. So for example, here is an article by a colleague of mine, Dr. Pienta at Johns Hopkins University, and he was measuring the harmonics of transfer through tissue into the cellular nucleus, about how as frequencies move through tissue, they change their vibrational plane and alter DNA transcription in the cell nucleus. And here's that idea here. You have the body really has this connective tissue network that is connecting all parts as a biotensegrity. And this means also that when you push on one part, it changes things all the way down into the cell nucleus, into how cancer genes are turned on and off and other genes and so forth. And it's all one coherent system. That's pretty amazing. If we did nothing else in medicine but show that we could use needles to turn off cancer genes, that would be quite a life's work. So basic principle, the writings of the Neijing have a lot of information. It's on different levels. Most of it's been unexplored. And in the West and also in China, I'd say too, where we look at real studies to say, what about this? We haven't seen too many of those related to Neijing medicine. But they have the potential to really reshape not only how people receive care, but how we think about health in general. This idea of the type 2 level of information, how we think about global issues differently. If you want to innovate in medicine, you can do it from within the story or from outside the story. For example, the story in cancer is about the thing coming to get you and having to kill the cells and so forth. And innovation in that story means to find a better poison or better chemotherapy or whatever, I should say. Innovating it from outside the story is really much more powerful. It's saying, let's look at this problem and just think about it in a completely different way. And that's really where really powerful change can come from. Okay, what about our times? I happen to think that this is probably one of the most exciting times in Chinese medicine, if not the most. And there's a lot of things coming together right now that make this a very interesting and exciting time to study these traditional ideas. One thing is that traditions were really the basis for human knowledge for a long time. And with the Industrial Revolution, that changed a bit. So we put aside traditions more for things that we were discovering and so forth. But now we're at a time, maybe a postmodern time, where we can start to bring traditions back in. And as you'll hear me talk, I'm not a fan of just going back to the old days, doing something in isolation without collaboration with others. I believe there's only one world. The problems are the same for people. And now is a time, but to bring older traditions and ideas into the mainstream to reinvigorate them and bring new life. So what's special about our time? Well, one thing is this internet and our global connectivity. This means really I can sit in my house in Portland, Oregon and teach someone across the world, which we'll be doing in our class every Sunday morning. And if there are colleagues I have somewhere, I can work with them every week online, or we can maintain a relationship. We can see patients together online. This is just really new and exciting, and joins us in a way that really we haven't been able to do before. And that means that we can take our medicine and bring it to places that we really couldn't do before. So the implications for this work are suddenly much wider, much greater, and that's really exciting. My main focus actually with all this work is global health, because the Neijing techniques are inexpensive, have few side effects, and can be used anywhere, and they don't need a lot of infrastructure. They're not there to replace Western medicine, but the Neijing ideas in Western medicine actually work really well together, because the Neijing medicine is very strong where Western medicine may be a little weaker, and so they tend to work well together. We have access to texts, so it has not always been the case that it's been easy to get all these books. Now they're all on databases now, and this is really the key issue, that they're on databases. That started when I started to study the Neijing. It made all the difference. It means that we can do character research in a way that we couldn't do before, which was just really impossible. So to go and look at a character, see how it's used through the Neijing and other texts, create a new definition for it, retranslate passages, helps us with our understanding. This has just been amazing, and it's really the basis of all of our work. There are new things in Western medicine, new ways to image things, to test things. For example, we were talking about the oncogenes. You can measure the activity of that now, and someone can do a treatment and see whether that actually changes things. So there's all sorts of things happening on the Western side. And then also techniques, Western medicine techniques. So for example, if you just look at surgery, for example, and the post-operative repair, post-operative experience of back pain, for example, these techniques, if they were included with the surgical approach, could just completely change the post-surgical experience of patients, and often treat them so they don't need the surgery in the first place. So these collaborations are good. And Western medicine is actually getting better in many ways, meaning that it's the interventional aspect is more sophisticated, anesthetics are better, so forth. So surgery is a lot better than it used to be. And then research. So now we're working a lot on research. How do you study old texts? How do you bring them into practice, into communities, make a difference, change the world, all that sort of stuff. So, one of the ideas we have is that people working in clinics around the world are part of a research network where we can put out research questions on traditional medicine, and those can be evaluated in clinics all over the world and then sent back to a central database. So all sorts of things are happening this way. It's a very exciting time. So here's all the special qualities of our time. We have all the texts. We can work with people in China. We couldn't work with people in China before China was opened up in the 70s. That's not the case now. We can work with our colleagues there. We can work with cynologists. We can work with ecologists who have expertise in river flow and other things that we use for the ecological model of healthcare. We can work with cancer researchers. And we can do it all online. And we can teach online. We can have our research network set up on an online web. And we can practice and supervise. If, say, someone's working on the other side of the world where we've trained people, we can check in with them once a week, or if there's an emergency or something, just online to see the patient. And then at the same time, Western medicine is continuing to develop and specialize, and those things are only going to help us. So these are all factors that have not been here in Chinese medicine before, and it's a very unique time. Okay, let's talk about the basic principles of Neijing medicine. We're going to go over these over and over again, so this is just our first pass. So the first thing is what I said before, that one of the things you want to get in your mind is that the Neijing description of the world is that the world you see around you is made by a world that you don't see, a world of motion and of change and those patterns, and they're mostly intangible. People who don't know that think that the world is set up by what they see. That, for example, global pollution is made by corporations who dump things into the environment, and if they didn't do that, nationalism is made by certain politicians, problems in your marriage is made by your partner. And the Neijing perspective is that's not true. That basically, that there are patterns of motion behind the scene, if you were to look behind the curtain, that make the environment or the factors needed to create that expression. And the thing is, if you know the patterns and you work on the level of that, it's much more powerful than trying to work on the outer level. So that's really the power of Neijing medicine in a nutshell, to know how nature operates behind the curtain. So the first principle is the universe is a phenomenon of continual change and motion. So even things that look solid, like the table I'm working on, it looks solid, it's actually in motion. It's just in slower motion. If I come back and look at this table in 600 years, it will be disintegrated or something like that. All things in the cosmos arise from intangible patterns of space-time motion that we don't see, we don't perceive. We see the manifestations of that motion, but behind the curtain, there's all these things happening that most people don't know about. By the end of this course, you will know about those things. The second is that all of those space-time motion patterns of change that are happening behind the curtain result from two basic impulses of the universe, and that is to expand and contract. So if you go down into the universe at its deepest level, it is basically an impulse to expand and move out and contract and move back. And we call this breath. So the second principle is all patterns of motion in the universe arise from two primary patterns, a force of expansion and a force of contraction. Put another way, the universe is a phenomenon of breath. In the Neijing, the primary force of expansion and contraction are called yin and yang. Yang is the tendency of the universe to expand, and yin is the tendency of the universe to contract. That happens, there's a materiality to that breath. There's a substance to it, so we call it fabric. And the fabric of that breath that's containing the impulses to expand and contract is called qi. The next thing is that most of the patterns of the universe are intangible. We don't see them. The things we do see are actually in the minority. This is true also in Western science. We know that most of the universe is dark matter, dark energy, and what we see is only a small fraction. It's the same idea here. So the next principle is that the vast majority of these motion patterns in the cosmos are intangible and not perceived by our normal senses. But in special cases like our Earth, these patterns become tangible. When energetic patterns become tangible, they are called xing, form. So in the West, and also in Chinese medicine, we often get caught up in this problem of, is it energy or is it matter? And that's really a question that has no meaning in the Neijing perspective. what we say is that there's patterns of motion that move along a spectrum from being intangible to tangible. So when thing becomes tangible, it's still a pattern of motion, but we can see it, and then we call it form. So these are not two separate boxes, two separate categories. They're just different states of the same thing. So our body, for example, is a xing. It's a form. So the other thing is, the next principle is that, well, you can't see the patterns of motion and change directly. They're invisible. You can see the manifestations of the patterns. And from that, you can work yourself backwards to what the patterns themselves are. So if we look at the world around us, which is the basis of Neijing natural science, and we look at the forms of things, we read backward into them the patterns of intangible motion that created them, and then we understand what's behind the curtain. So for example, here's a fish, and one thing we can say about this, just looking at it in a cursory way, is that the motion patterns around that there was one axial pattern or one central pattern, which is the spine, and then there was things that went out to the side. So there was something about the patterns behind the curtain that made a structure that looked like this. And we can then start talking about that pattern. So the next principle is all physical forms in the universe evolved to maximize the efficiency of the space-time circulation moving through them at the time of their development. Thus, while the space-time patterns that govern the cosmos cannot be perceived directly, they can be known and studied through the physical forms that arise in relationship to their patterns. And this is the basis of Neijing natural science. Look at nature, the things of nature, discern the patterns, organize the patterns into principles, understand how the universe works. So immensely powerful. Okay, so the next thing here is that all living things, including the human body, are living in a field of constant motion and change. So when we look at our body, we think we're kind of a solid thing. Everything's within our body. We're self-contained. But the reality is we're more like fish that are swimming in the ocean in a tide pool where the waters are moving in and out. And everything in our body is changing in relationship to those patterns. So when something changes in nature, something changes inside of us. Our blood flow changes. Things are moving in and out all the time. So another thing about the Neijing model is we're very connected to the environment. And when there's changes in the environment, like the moon, there's instantaneous changes in your body, in the circulation, and so forth. So the next thing is that all living things live within a complex field of space-time motion. And in the Neijing, if you're moving with these patterns or against them is a really big deal. So when we're moving with these patterns, it's called a shun pattern or a flow pattern. And when we're moving against these patterns, it's called a counterflow or a ni pattern in Chinese. Again, if the Chinese characters are getting a bit much, don't worry. We're going to see these characters all the way through the year. And the idea here is that really the key part about being healthy is whether or not your circulation can move with these patterns or against them. If we want to know what counterflow looks like in the human body, the Western term for it is inflammation. Or when we see an inflammatory condition anywhere in the body, we're going to translate that into Neijing thinking by calling it a counterflow problem and saying things are moving backwards. It's just like putting a rock in a river and seeing the counterflow against the rock and all the turbulence it makes. It's the same idea. And here's those characters, shun and ni. So on the left, we have the character, the radical for water, which I told you before was about a pattern of how things are moving in nature. On the right side is a person floating, and they're floating with the water, basically. It's like you jump in a river, on an inner tube, you float down. Here's the character for counterflow. On the left side of this character, we have a picture of a foot moving, which means it's about a motion. It's about something moving. And then we have the person, but in this case, on the right side, we have the person, he's hanging upside down. So the person is going against the way things are moving. If you wanted to rename the book of the Neijing, you could call it the Book of Flow and Counterflow and be very accurate. So principle number 6 is that moving with nature's breath, these patterns, promotes health, vitality, and longevity. Moving against them creates disease, suffering, and premature death, and this is the source of all human illnesses. So really, life is what happens in the middle of breath. When breath is moving, life and vitality emerges. When breath is not moving, health is impaired, you die earlier, and you have illnesses. It's really that simple. So here's a thing you can do when you go into the clinic tomorrow. This is very physical. You can ask someone to breathe, and you can look at their body and see where breath is moving and where breath is not moving. And at a very deep level, and in terms of Neijing science, where breath is not moving, that's where an illness can arise or is. And so here's the idea here, that these patterns are moving. They're very powerful. They engender life within us. Our body is made around them. And so if we're moving with them, nature is keeping us healthy. And if we're moving against them, you can imagine like going in on a surfboard versus trying to swim out against the waves. That's the difference. Okay, the summary for our lecture today. The Neijing text is an ancient source of knowledge. It contains information on multiple levels. It's not a textbook like we normally think. It's actually much more powerful than that. There's a few keys we're going to need to get into the text and get that information. You'll learn those in the course, and you'll just see how much information is in there. It's a little overwhelming, actually, how much is in there. Most of this knowledge has never been studied in a systematic way. There have been practitioners who study it, scholars, but taking a team approach with sinologists, medical researchers, really hasn't been done, at least in the West, and I don't even think in China very much. The information in these texts has a potential to reframe how we understand both Chinese and Western medicine. And information in these texts has a potential to better the lives of billions of people and save trillions of dollars in healthcare costs. This last one, I'm always a little hesitant to say. I think it's absolutely true. If you look at Dr. Tu Yoyo and her looking in the herbal text, finding an herb out of context and saving the lives of millions of people. And when we look at trillions of dollars, the amount of money that's spent on healthcare is just staggering. So for example, if you make a 1% change in musculoskeletal medicine illnesses, in 20 years, you'd have saved $8 trillion. And we're looking at changes where it's not 1% that these techniques do. It's 70, 80 to 90%. So whether we can translate it into all that is another thing, but it has the potential to do that. So please remember that about your profession. And that's the end of our first lecture. Congratulations.